Good afternoon, quilters. I'm coming to you this afternoon from a blizzardy day in Minnesota. So the boys are home on a snow day, but they happen to be outside playing. So I was working on finishing up the binding on this table runner from my Trendy Table 3 book, and I thought I would do a quick video on how to do these angles. So they're not your typical 90-degree corner. They are greater than a 90-degree corner, but I think you'll realize when I show you how it's done that you already know how to do this corner. But so often people just wing it and see what happens because they don't have a technique or a plan, and so each little corner turns out slightly different. But I'm going to show you the technique that I use to get perfect corners every time. So this might be kind of wobbly being I don't have an overhead camera holder and I'm just holding the iPad by hand, but hopefully you get an idea how this is done. So the first thing we're going to talk about is this seam allowance right here. And I've mentioned this before, but this seam allowance is roughly 1/6 of the width of what you cut your binding. So I cut my binding 2.5 inches wide, pressed it in half with wrong sides together, as you can see here. And my seam allowance is a scant 3/8, because if you divide that 2.5 by 6, you get about 3/8 of an inch. But because of the thickness of the batting and the turn of the fabric, it's just going to be slightly less. What you're going for is when you fold this, see if I can do this with one hand, when you fold this to the back side, you want it to just meet your stitching line right there so that the binding is completely filled out. There isn't an empty gap in there. So now that we've established what width of seam allowance we're going to do here, we need to figure out where do we stop on this corner to do our little back stitch and pivot. So over here on this corner, I have drawn in the line for where this seam allowance would intersect with this seam allowance right there. So that's going to be our stopping point. And I've also drawn it, let's see if I can get my finger in here. I've also drawn it here as just a dot. So typically I would draw just a dot, but I wanted to draw the line so you can see what the concept is. So that dot is where you're going to stop and backstitch, which is what I have done here. So if you were to look underneath, where I stopped right here is where that dot is. Now you're going to turn your quilt. So here I am at my machine. You're going to turn it so that you're ready to do the next side on the quilt. Now the trick is learning how to fold this. So you're going to fold it straight up just like you normally do with a 90-degree corner. And you're going to kind of pull it up as far as it'll go. That stitching will catch you from pulling it too far. Then you're going to pull it forward like this. And the trick is going to be in knowing where this should stop. Now if you were to imagine that this was just an ordinary corner, like 90 degrees, like the ruler I've laid here. So 90 degrees off of this little point right here, that gives you a visual of exactly how your binding is going to be folded there. So I need to come down just slightly on this. And I'll show you one more time. If you were to lay that ruler at a 90-degree corner coming off that little point out there, that's where your binding needs to be folded. Now if you were to come in a little like this, see if I can zoom in a little, so that you don't have much of a fold there, you're going to get a rounded corner instead of a nice point. And if you were to fold it up, say too high, like see how I have this fold above that point, there you can see it a little bit better, then you're going to get a corner that has a bunchy, kind of a knobby thing on the outer corner. And if you fold it just right, like what I showed you with that 90-degree corner off of there, you're going to get a nice, perfectly mitered corner. So now what you're going to do is bring it to the machine and you're going to start sewing with that scant 3/8 inch seam allowance. You're going to come down to the point here, and remember how we drew that little dot? See if I can get that in there. See the little dot? That's where you're going to stop and backstitch. And then you're going to treat this corner again the same as what you did right up there. Now if you have any questions, please be sure to let me know in the comments. But that is how you sew an outside corner that is not 90 degrees. And that same technique will work if it's, any kind of unusual angle that's greater than 90 degrees. That same technique will work. Now that I've gone all the way around my quilt, I just wanted to show you a close-up of the corners after they're all sewn. So you see my miter here is coming right directly off that outside point, like I showed you. So they all look nice and clean. Then I wanted to show you one more thing, and that's how I make my binding a continuous piece. So the trick is in knowing what do I cut this length to. So you can see I have the piece I started with pinned to the quilt. Then I'm going to lay my piece of binding on top, that long tail that hasn't been cut yet. And then I'm going to take, this is just a little scrap that I cut off the binding earlier. That's going to be sort of my template. Let's see, it's hard to hold the camera, do this at the same time, but I laid that down even with the edge of that binding piece underneath. Then I'm going to cut the overlap to this length of this piece. This is cut 2.5 because that's the width of my binding. So this overlap here is cut 2.5. Now if you had, say, 2-inch binding, then that overlap is going to be 2 inches. If you had 3-inch wide binding, that overlap is going to be 3 inches. You get the idea. Then you're going to take your scissor and cut that overlap right there. So the last thing I want to show you is how I end these tails. So I've gone all the way around my runner. You can see I've made my way around and I'm at the ending point, and I want to know how to make an invisible seam in here. And I don't want to have to use any confusing techniques or tools or anything. So I'm going to show you the technique that I use. So this is the end I started with. So I have that laid out flat and I have it pinned so that it's nice and smooth here. Then you're going to take the tail that you ended with and you're going to overlap it. And we're paying attention to where that little piece is right there. So I fold it so I can see that. Then I'm going to take a little scrap that I cut off the binding. So this is 2.5-inch wide binding. So this is a 2.5-inch piece. And I'm going to lay that down. So do you see how I have it even here with that cut edge underneath? Then I'm going to measure over and cut the top layer even with that edge. So just to explain the math on that, if this binding is cut 2.5 inches, this little scrap is 2.5 inches, this overlap is cut 2.5 inches. If you had 2-inch wide binding, your little scrap would be 2 inches wide, you'd cut your overlap to 2 inches. And the same if it was 3 inches. So I've turned my runner here, but you can see that I have this overlap now cut to the width of this binding. And the reason I turn this is so it'd be a little easier to show you this next step. So now you're going to lay this right side up, take this pin out, set that to the side, and then you're going to open this up and you're going to lay it on top at a 90-degree corner. So it's just like every other seam that you showed in your binding. So I'm going to set my camera down and pin that in place. Okay, now you can see I have this laying at a 90-degree corner, and then you're going to sew from point up here to that little point that's hidden right underneath there. You're going to sew across that seam. So one way to think about that, because a lot of people tell me they accidentally sew the wrong seam, I think about this as being a leg and this as being a leg, and then you're going to sew the waistband. You're not going to sew this way like a crotch seam. You're going to sew the little waistband on those legs. So I'll go ahead and sew that and come back. Okay, now you can see that I've gone ahead. If you look closely, my thread is pretty matchy, but you can see I've sewn across that diagonal. Then you can trim off this outer corner right here so that you get that out of your seam allowance and it doesn't add bulk to it. But once that's trimmed, you're going to be able to see that this fits perfectly along the edge of the quilt, and then you can go ahead and finish that stitching, and you won't be able to tell where you started and stopped when you made your binding. Super slick, no special tools, no tech.